First things first, we are going to use a Jamboard link in order to share today's work, and I'm going to share it on my screen, and I'll ping the, do you want to send a link to the Jamboard first? Thank you. Nina will post it on the chat. And while I'm doing that, I'll also share my screen. Okay, so my screen is shared. Are you able to still see the screen, Nina?
I see it.
Okay, thank you. Because I moved the window from one monitor to another, so I was wondering whether the screen share had any problem. Okay, thank you. So first things first, what we are going to do is we are going to validate that each one of you are able to access the Jamboard. So if you can look at the Jamboard link. Okay, Nina has posted on the Jamboard a tiny URL link. If you click on it, it'll take you to the Jamboard. I see people coming in. And once you're in it, we'll go on to slide 2. And we have some icebreaker questions where you can participate, and at that time we can indeed validate that you are able to put stuff on the Jamboard in terms of post-it notes. So we want to make this very, very participatory. Okay, so I'm going on to the next slide. So this slide, so we're starting at the first icebreaker question. So the 10 is an example. So you can just use on the left side of the screen, you have the Jamboard features. So you can use this one, which is this is a sticky note, and you can choose a color of sticky note, and you can answer the question and hit save. It'll just put it on the board, and you can move it on the board and leave it anywhere. So just to know what kind of participant experience is there so that we can structure this session appropriate to the audience. So we'll take a minute, and if you can put stickies on the screen. So on the left side, you have the post-it, so sticky note, click on that, and then you'll be able to enter a value or type anything that you want, and then put it on the board.
Are we supposed to be answering a question?
That is correct. Yeah, you can just say 5, 10, 1, new, long time, whatever you want to put it. It also validates that that Jamboard is working for you. Thank you. And if any of you have any difficulties, let us know and we can work through it at this time. This is the second slide in the Jamboard. So yeah, I think people are putting on the first slide, so testing, new note. So what I'd suggest is move on to the second slide by hitting the right button on the top. So it goes on to the next frame. I apologize for forgetting to let you know about that. So the second slide, which is pulled up on the screen, it has the first question, which is the first. So yeah. Thank you, Danish. Less than a year. Another 30 seconds. A lot of tens out here. Incidentally, the Scrum Guide has been there for the last 10 years. It was first published in 2010. When I first started Scrum in 2005, there was no Scrum guide. Ken had just published a book, but that was much after we started using Scrum. So in fact, I read about Scrum in a Microsoft TechNet article about it. So that's how I was introduced. So it's a very strange place to learn Scrum from, but that's where I read about it first and learned from. Some folks at Microsoft were indeed using Scrum for their development activity at that time. So that activity was what taught me Scrum. So moving on to the next question. So we see some patterns. There are some newer people, and then there are folks who have been using it for a while as well. So especially if you're using it for a long time, I strongly encourage you to pitch in, join in, and participate in the conversation when we start discussing deeply the structure behind Scrum. Thank you. Moving on to the next slide, if you hit Jamboard and you go on to page 3, just again, this is a type of role that you are using Scrum. Are you using it as a Scrum Master? Are you on the team? Are you a product owner? Are you a coach? Are you outside the team? Are you supporting them from the outside? So some kind of a role, so we know how you participate or use Scrum at work. So software engineering, that's nice. Another 30 seconds. So we have some ideas of the roles. So different types of folks engage differently. So that's what we're trying to get an idea of how people are engaged. Again, just to give us some context for these conversations. Okay, moving on. Let's move on to slide number 4 on Jamboard page 4. And of course, this is a very simple question. Did you get a chance to read Scrum Guide 2020? It's not mandatory. We have put the link and it's been publicly available since the 18th of November. So there is a no, not yet. So the good news is the Scrum Guide has significantly become smaller. It used to be about 19 pages. Now it's down to about 13 pages overall. So it's much smaller than before. It's more concise. I used to call the Scrum Guide, the previous version, as not written for humans. So I feel that it is slightly improved. It's a little more readable. And there's a little less ambiguity in interpretation of the guide, but then there are lots of terminologies still remain. And terminologies mean different interpretation to different people. And sometimes I wonder, perhaps the guide should have a glossary at its end to define the terms. There's no ambiguity that people read differently into the terms. And that's some of the things that we are going to do today, is look at what do words mean and how in what context do we look at that. So it's good to know. It's quite okay not to read. Contextually, there's not much of a big change. It's the same Scrum as before, but it's the nuances of trying to convey that message to the people who use them. That is what is trying a new version of it. So I'm moving on to the future slides. From here on, we start the participatory work. And each of these slides, you can, as we talk through that, and if you have questions about that slide content, you can put post-its on the slide itself. So we want to keep that open for you. So that's why I don't have any slides today. Everything's on Jamboard. And as we talk through this, then we are going to do it in a very participatory manner. So we can open your mics as well. Nina, if you can unmute everybody or allow them to unmute themselves, if you can
They should
do
all
that.
be able to do it themselves.
They can jump in and talk to their questions or even answer questions for that matter. So first thing is, again, before we step forward, I want to also validate your objectives of being here today. So essentially, of course, I'm aware that you all want to know more about Scrum Guide 2020 and what the key changes are. So other than that, are there any other specific objectives that you had in mind or questions that you wanted answers to? You can put it here, and we'll either cover it during our conversations, or we'll come back and revisit it at the end of today's session. If you're not covered it, we'll come back and revisit the slide to make sure that we have covered your questions. So I'll just leave it about 30 seconds. So if you want to throw in some questions, you can feel free to do that right now. Okay, looks like there is no questions now. We can always come back. You can keep adding questions to this slide if you have anything that, as we do the conversations, and we can come back and revisit it. Again, either there, or you can put it, we have a Q&A slide as well in slide 6, so you can put it there. I'm going to jump ahead and get into some meat of it. So one of the things that Scrum Guide does do is it provides a Scrum in a nutshell section, which is added right on top of the Scrum Guide. So this calls out what Scrum is in 3 different lines. So in a nutshell, it says Scrum requires a Scrum Master to foster an environment. So it calls out that a Scrum Master is required to foster the Scrum environment. And a product owner orders the work for complex problem into a product backlog. So there is a product owner role who helps ordering the work into a product backlog. There's a Scrum team that turns a selection of the work into an increment of value during the sprint. So there's a team, a people of doers who can do the work, who take a piece of the complex problem from the product backlog and try to create the work, turn the work into an increment of value during the sprint, or whatever the sprint duration might be. Of course, according to the Scrum Guide, a sprint can be a maximum duration of 1 month or lower. And then at the end of the sprint, the Scrum team and its stakeholders inspect the results of that sprint and then make the necessary adjustments. What did the sprint tell us? Were we able to build? Did we ship it? And if we built it, what were we able to build? All of it? Did we build differently than we envisaged initially when we talked about it? And then where do we go from here? So step 4 is repeat. We take again another portion of the same complex problem or a different complex problem from the backlog, and we redo the work. So it's an iterative incremental work, which is what Scrum does. And now Scrum calls it out in this 4 lines. So that's really what the crux of Scrum is. So, and any thoughts on that? The only adjustment I made to the picture is this is from less.works. Again, we use a similar picture for a Scrum team. The only thing is the Scrum guide has removed the word potentially shippable, and it just says increment right now. That makes it very explicit that the intent is to complete work and deliver it to customers if feasible. So it's not, the potential shippable had a lot of ambiguity. Is it shippable or not? Does it require any further work? And when will it be shipped? Or do we keep on accumulating in sprints and not ship at all, which leads to several organizations and teams actually continuing to build just like waterfall for a long period of time without shipping and claiming that it's all potentially shippable. So that ambiguity has been removed. So that's why I scratched off in the picture, the term potentially shippable is now just a product increment. Any questions or thoughts on this before we move on? If you had any thoughts or questions, you can just make a post-it and put it right on the slide, or you can open the mic and chat to it directly as well. Okay, so I'm moving on to the next slide, which is Jamboard slides 8. And if you want to follow on your screen, you can also click on your Jamboard to move to slide 8. Now, I'm a big fan of Scrum as a heuristic. The reason is we often think of any structure as rules. And one of the challenges with the rules are highly rigid, but rules have to be flexed in terms of context. So instead of rules, I help teams or people who use Scrum derive it into some kind of a heuristic. What do we do in any kind of situation? So what I've taken is I use this in my class. So I've taken Scrum in a nutshell and converted into the heuristic which I use is generally this is how Scrum is done. The rule of thumb is to form a cross-functional, stable, long-lived, self-managed team supported by a single product owner and a product backlog. And so when I mean team, it's teams, it could be multiple teams, it could be more than one team supported by a single product owner and product backlog, and as many Scrum Masters required in order to support that implementation of Scrum. And generally, whoever helps set this up, they get out of the way. So don't stand in their way. And from a stakeholder or management perspective, support them in making the team better and help them inspect the work in the market with active stakeholder participation. So essentially that's the rule of thumb, is that form a team, help form a team, allow the team or teams to do the work and ship it to the market, and active stakeholder participation and management support in order for the team and the product owner to be able to do the work. So that's essentially Scrum as a heuristic. Again, the change is very clear. You know, the potentially shippable has changed. So generally, I strike that off from the picture. So this one is not there, and it's just a product increment now. The picture still needs to be updated. Perfect. Thank you. So any questions or thoughts on this? Does this work at all in your context, the way it is described as a rule of thumb, or does it work any differently in the way Scrum is practiced in your context? Any thoughts? Chris, you had something to say?
No, I just had a weird message.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Okay, so moving on, the next thing that we wanted to start looking at is the team itself. What are the changes related to the team? And especially Scrum Guide also calls out around how to work with multiple teams. So we thought we will actively discuss around that. So I pulled out and marked from the Scrum Guide the key concepts that has been stated there. So without much ado, so the Scrum team is cross-functional. We already discussed that. They're also self-managing. They decide what to do, when and how. And the teams are small. The earlier Scrum Guide used to have between 3 and 9 people. So now it says typically 10 or fewer people. But if you look at the science of teams, generally communication starts breaking down around the size of 15 or so. So if you look at the science of small teams, most effective small teams are in the size of 5 to 15. And there is a lot of research around that. And if you're interested, if you ping me, I can provide you with books to read and articles on the subject. And it's anywhere between 5 and 15, but again, context matters. It depends on the type of work you're doing, and it's not the same answer for every type of work, because even software teams, in most cases, the software stack could be different in the context of the team's work, and depending on the situation, that varies. The guide also says that if the Scrum teams become too large, they should consider reorganization into multiple cohesive Scrum teams. So eventually the picture on the right, so if the team becomes too large, then the teams would break into smaller teams, each focused on the same product, so a same product owner and product backlog. And therefore, they should also share the same product goal, product backlog, and product owner. Ming Lam says that he's interested in reading articles about optimum team size. What I will do is post this session when I'll be sending out the material with the recording and the slides. I'll also send some reading material around team sizes and how it makes sense. There are also several recommended books to read. And again, there's a lot of research around teams from a variety of folks, and these research have context in them. So for example, there's even a definition of what is a team in a multitude of ways. In some types of teams, there is hierarchy. For example, if you take teams that are in a hospital, I'm not saying that a surgeon is going to use Scrum to do surgery, but even those teams, those are called crews. In those contexts, if you look at hospital, it's a crew. If you look at maybe a team that launches maybe aircraft from an aircraft carrier, they are a crew, and so forth. An airline is a crew, a collection of people who come together to meet a goal and then disperse at the end of meeting the goal. Maybe a flight is a goal. Whereas in case of our teams, we're talking about long living teams, which are cognitively diverse and doing cognitive problem solving. That is mostly the big difference, is that then we're not doing physical work with Scrum, though of course, Ken and Jeff Kim now continue to say that Scrum can be used for anything, but the appropriate context is complex work. And so it's not really anything that is complex to do. So when you're cohesive Scrum teams, they should share the same product goal, product backlog, and product owner. So that is the crux of it. And the Scrum team is responsible to all product related activities, including stakeholder collaboration, verification, maintenance. Everything is done by the Scrum team. And they are to be structured and empowered by the organization to manage the work and do the work. And the entire Scrum team is accountable for creating a value. So earlier in the Scrum guide, there were two terms. One was called the development team, and then there was the concept of the Scrum team. The development team was everybody excluding the Scrum master and the product owner. And the Scrum team was the development team and the Scrum master and the product owner. Now they've dropped the word development team, but they continue to keep the team members are called developers. And that's a very confusing term. A lot of people think developers means they are software developers. They are not. It would have helped to add the word product developers. So if you're working on a product, you have a product backlog and you have a product owner. Anybody who contributes by doing work is a product developer, somebody who does work towards a product. So an analyst is a developer, a tester is a developer. So yes, there's a question which says, so this means that there is one PO working with multiple Scrum teams. That is correct. The notion of a product is that to have a product which can meet customer needs, where multiple teams work together, the ability to create work that they can ship together is what defines the product. So there, yes, there will be one single product backlog and one single product owner for the entire product. That is correct. That's the crux of product management. When you have two cooks trying to cook a product, it doesn't work. Though there might be a multitude of stakeholders who are supporting the product, in the product context, there's only one decision maker for the product who decides what happens in the next sprint. And if you clearly look at it, the only thing that the product owner does is ordering of the backlog, in what order this work should be done. The needs do not come from the product owner. Some of them might, the product owner might also be in a product manager role, but in most cases, the needs come from operations, the needs come from other product managers, the needs come from other product stakeholders, and generally the needs come from customers. So yes, that question is correct. So the PO works with multiple Scrum teams. Are there any other questions? If you have any questions, you can also unmute yourself and directly have a conversation as well, not necessary to type as well. Okay, so that is pretty much the prepared material I had. And what I did do is I made a list of key changes that have happened in the Scrum guide. So we're just going to use one tool. We are going to use PollEV to get your answers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my sharing and we are going to use PollEV. And the link is there on the chat. And if you go to PollEV, you can see the question there with the options. There are a variety of changes on the Scrum guide. So what we're trying to do is to figure out what your interests are. And once you've voted on it, then what we will do is we'll come back and look at, we will structure the conversation based on what you're interested in. So I'm going to share my screen on the PollEV screen. The link to PollEV is with you. And if you go to the link pollev.com/2agility101 in your browser, you would be able to.
I think you have to make the poll active. It's not active at the moment.
Where do I have to do that? 1 second. Sorry, folks. It doesn't give me an option to activate, Nina.
Let me check.
but you were able to activate it last time.
Yeah, it looks like it says it's waiting for your presentation to begin.
Okay, I can try that. I can hit present. How about now? Yes.
Yep, that's it. It came up.
Thank you. So read the questions. You can answer multiple answers, and if you decide what your interests are, we can dive deeper into that. Because we have only certain amount of time, and in the interest of time, I thought the best way is to look at what you're interested in and then focus on those rather than all aspects of it. Okay, so I think we're going to pass the poll. We have some idea there. I think we're going to focus on 4 of those today. There is the formal commitments to each artifact. The second, which has got the highest votes now, the self-organization and self-management, accountability versus responsibility, and planning as 3 different parts. So we'll start with one of them and then we'll come back and revisit the rest of them as well. So I'm going to stop the share and get back to my Jamboard again. Okay, hope you're able to see the screen again.
Yeah, I see it.
Thank you. Okay. So the first thing that we are going to look at is, let's start with the formal commitments for each artifact, and then we'll move on to some of these. I don't have slides, but I can quickly pull up some pictures from my less.works website, which we have extensive material there. As you know, I'm a large-scale Scrum practitioner, and large-scale Scrum extends one team Scrum into multi-team Scrum, basically out of the Scrum guide itself. So what are formal commitments for each artifacts? So let's look at what are the artifacts first of all, and then we will go from there. So one, formal commitments to artifacts. So there are 3 there are 3 artifacts that are there, and I'm going to just write them out on the slides. So there are 3 artifacts in Scrum. Can you help name the artifacts on Scrum, or what are the 3 artifacts?
We are on page 12 of the Jamboard, if anybody's looking.
Yes, we are on page 12 of the Jamboard. But of course, the screen is also shared. So if you're not really wanting to type anything into it, then you can directly. So the first artifact.
Yeah, I think for the screen that we're seeing the poll results. I'm not sure.
We still see
Are you
your
sharing
computer.
something different?
Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
we see
seeing
your
the poll
computer.
results and looks like some other document behind. Yeah.
That is strange. I thought I shared the right screen. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. How about now?
That looks more like it. You've got the slide, Sharon.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, so the three artifacts, formal commitment for the three artifacts. So product backlog is the first artifact. The next artifact is the sprint backlog. So this is product backlog. Sprint backlog. And the third artifact that we have is the increment, or what we finish during the sprint is the third one. Now, how do we commit to a product backlog? We commit to a product backlog in a sprint by understanding the product goals. So the commitment for the product backlog to the sprint backlog happens during planning. And when we do planning, what we do is we take portion of the product backlog to create the sprint backlog, and keeping in mind the product goals, we derive a sprint backlog, the list of items that we plan to do in the sprint, which is also called sprint backlog items. And we have a theme for the sprint, which is the sprint goals. So the sprint goals is the commitment for the items that we do in the sprint. And then during the end of the sprint, we go look at the increment. The increment is at the quality of the definition of done, whatever we said the standards to which we will deliver it. And then the inspection is whether the commitment has been met in the sprint review. And there are intermediary checkpoints of whether we are on track for our sprint goal commitments on a daily basis, which is called the daily Scrum. So the daily meetings where we are meeting every day, the team meets every day to review the work that has been done in the last 24 hours and whether we are on track to do the work. To review the commitment is the daily Scrum meeting. So that's the formal commitment. So if you read the Scrum guide, of course, the Scrum guide goes into more length to talk about that. So a new item called the product goals has been added. So you have a goal. So the reason for all that is that humans are very goal oriented. And so we have these big goals that we want to achieve. We've also heard organizations use OKRs, objective and key results. So in which case the product goals are the objectives, the product objectives, and then we break it down into smaller goals that we're going to say, okay, in the next 2 weeks or the next 3 weeks, our goal in the context of the larger goal is to do these following sprint backlog items, which we took from the product backlog. And the goal of the sprint is to meet that particular goal. The theme of the goal is these item constitutes a portion of the goals of the product goal. And that's our commitment. And then we come to the daily commitment is what is our goal for today is our daily commitment in the daily Scrum. And then how are we going to do that is the discussion. What am I going to do today in support of today's goals, in support of the larger sprint goals across the whole sprint, and in support of the much larger product goals overall for the product. And that's what these commitments are. Does it make sense? Any questions or an example or anything like that would you want?
If you're offering, I always like examples.
Of course. So what kind of example can I give? A product example. So Let's say I'm building a product. Again, I don't want to get into context of products like software and hardware development. Products like iPhone come to my mind, or maybe I'm building a Fitbit watch come to my mind. So even if you look at it that way, let me take a Fitbit watch. There is somebody putting together the new screen, somebody is putting together the new elements, hardware of the watch, and there's a team writing the software for the watch. So the larger product goal is that on a particular day, might be the product goal is much earlier to Thanksgiving, or by October of the year, or maybe September of the year, we want to launch the next version of Fitbit in the market. That's your product goal. But that's the larger overarching goal, that you want to get this product out to the market. But then you're not going to build all of the product all at the same time. So then you go into planning. In the context, you're aware of the overall goal. Yes, we have to ship this new product with these new features by this date. You then go into sprint planning, where you say, what can I do in the next 3 or 4 weeks that I can now commit to do so. So for example, if I don't have the hardware ready, and I don't have a Fitbit hardware ready for the next generation Fitbit, typically the teams start working on an emulator. They build something that emulates the hardware in a way that will perform on the screen, the software, like the hardware itself. So instead of running the software on the hardware, they would run it on the emulator to make sure that it runs the same way. So they can say, in the next sprint, I'm going to build these 4 or 5 features in the next 3 or 4 weeks and test it on the emulator, so that I am ready to meet the overall product goals when the hardware is ready in the larger context. So that becomes the sprint goal. So now we are committed to build and testing certain type of features in a particular platform, being ready for the overall product launch. And then to a definition of done. A definition of done is it works on the emulator right now, and that might evolve. So a couple of sprints later, you might have a beta version of the hardware, and your definition of done would be, instead of running it on the emulator, now I'm committed not only to test it on the emulator, but also on the beta version of hardware that the hardware team has provided to me, so that the software is validated as working on the hardware that we are building to ship, including the actual sensors on Fitbit that work. If you have something that like a heart rate sensor, or a step counting sensor, or a SpO2 sensor, in this case it's which measures the oxygen level. Or if you look at the latest Fitbit has got what is called as stress sensor. It kind of measures the temperature of the screen and is able to tell you whether you're stressed based on that, based on its variations, what your emotion is, and so forth. So you start building those features so you can test it along with the hardware. So those are the 3 level of goals and 3 level of commitments aligned to that. You're always keeping the big product goal in the context. Then you're always also keeping in the context of the bigger goal, I'm committing to a smaller goal over a shorter period of time. And then in the context of that sprint goal, you're committing to a daily goal. Now that we know this is what we need to do in the next 3 to 4 weeks, now what can I do tomorrow, or what can I do today in the context of what I did yesterday, in order to do something to the definition of done, which is towards my sprint goal and my larger product goal. So that's how the formal commitments happen. Now, commitments are generally a commitment to try. A commitment is not means that you will definitely do it, right? So if you look at it, Scrum is an empirical process. And empiricism means you inspect and adapt. So when you commit to something, so for example, if I'm a runner and I want to run the New York Marathon, and that's my larger product goal, and like a person like me, I've never run before, then I'm definitely not going to say, I'm going to directly run a marathon. I'm probably not going to finish, or probably going to end up in hospital with a heart attack at best if I start running a marathon today. So what I do is I first plan, no, I'm not even running, but I'm a good walker. So what I will start doing every day is start walking 10 kilometers every day So my first sprint goal is for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to commit myself to start walking 10 kilometers every day. And my definition of done is on a daily basis, I'm trying to improve my walking speed so that I start walking my first day in about 45 minutes or 1 hour, I mean, or 1.5 hours. And then my progression by the end of the week is to improve that to less than an hour if I can walk 10 kilometers in an hour. So that could be my daily commitment when I start would be, yesterday I walked 10 kilometers and it took me an hour and 40 minutes. Today I'm going to see whether I can do it in an hour and 30 minutes would be my commitment for the day. So that my definition of done for the day is going to be that standard as an example. So my following sprint, after I'm able to meet the sprint that I'm indeed able to walk 10 kilometers, I could say I'm going to now partly start jogging. I'm going to jog partly. When I'm not able to jog, I'll walk again. And when I'm not able to, after I've rested by walking a little bit, I'll jog again. And therefore, I'll be able to do a mixture of jog and walk in the next sprint and so forth. So it is progressively getting better at your goals so that you reach your overall goals. Does that give a better context to the goal management and commitment?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So if we don't have much on this, we will move on to the next item again, because these are interrelated. So we potentially come back to these again in further questions as well. So the next one that we had is self-organization and is now self-management. And then we have accountability versus responsibility. That's the thing which is there. Now these are kind of related. Accountability and responsibility are highly interrelated to self-organization and self-management. So why don't we start looking at what are these terms and what does it mean? So I'm just moving on to Jamboard slide 15. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a picture and paste it on the slide. Again, I didn't know which one will come up for conversation, so I didn't prepare for this, but it'll take me just a minute to pull up a picture. So I'm going to pick up this picture from the Large Scale Scrum website, and Large Scale Scrum, as you know, is built on top of Scrum. It's the same construct where there's a single product owner and product backlog, but more focuses on multiple teams rather than individual teams. And I'm going to pick up the slide on management. There's a nice picture there. This is what I was looking at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this image and I'm going to paste it on Jamboard so we can now discuss the picture. Okay, so this is a very simple way of looking at the problem. If you really look at today's world of work, so if you're not using Scrum, you normally here you have manager-led teams. That's where you are. You have a project manager or a development lead or a team lead who leads the team, and the team does the task. So what happens is the team just follows what they're asked to do. And that's the first step in standard management is manager-led teams. So eventually, if there's a problem in the goals not being met, then often it's not the team's responsibility. So the bottom one is responsibility. And here, these are goals. So if you look at the first step, manager-led teams, the team has no responsibility. The team has responsibility only to do the work. They are only responsible to do the tasks that they're supposed to do, nothing more than that. Now that is not self-organization or self-management. In self-managing team, the team also monitors and manages the work. So that is a level 2 team. So I'm just going to change the color for us to have a better conversation. There we go. Let's do blue. So to do Scrum and self-managing teams, as Scrum recommends, Scrum used to call it self-organizing teams, and self-organizing is the third one. Now they've really gone back one step from there to here, unfortunately. So they've gone from self-designing teams to self-managing teams. So self-managing teams do two things. One, they do the tasks that they're supposed to do, and they also monitor and manage the work and its progression. So it's not the manager who's doing it. And manager's responsibility is designing the team and its organizational context, and setting an overall direction belongs to the managers here from outside the team. So the team is responsible for tasks and monitoring their own progress against the task. So that's what a self-managing team is. Self-designing teams, which is what it was before, because it was self-organized, and self-organized could be either at the level of self-design or self-governing teams as well. So if you look at this, self-organized teams could be at these levels. They could also own the concept of designing the team, and they can also own the concept of setting an overall direction. Now, Scrum does several of these as well. It's a little hard. There are techniques at an organization level like holacracy, where the whole team decides what work to do. That's very hard to achieve, but some organizations do that. If you recently saw the news, day before yesterday, Tony Shea of Zappos.com, he died in a house fire a couple of days ago. And that's Zappos is one of the key organizations based out of Las Vegas, the shoe retailer, who is a holacracy practitioner, where all decisions are taken by the team members themselves, including what the customers want and what to prioritize. So they manage the product backlog as well, or even what to fund, what to do, what not to do is all decided by the teams. And that's a very hard construct in today's organizations, which are hugely command and control. So essentially what's happened in the Scrum Guide this time is that it is kind of moved from self-designing teams to self-managing teams. That's what Scrum recommends. But however, at a large-scale Scrum level, when you have multitude of teams, we still recommend self-designing teams when there are multiple teams. We still recommend that teams at least start here for large-scale Scrum. And can anyone say why we want the teams to design themselves? Do you want to fathom a guess about that? Let's say I have 5 teams, and you do not want somebody from outside designing what these 5 teams are individually going to do, but you want the teams to do it themselves. Why would you do that? Why would you give that power over to the team instead of managers from the outside doing it for them? Any guesses? also type it in the chat if you don't want to speak. Okay. So the reason why why do we want to allow the teams to monitor and work progress and work process? If you look at self-managing teams, the reasons why we want the teams to monitor their work process and their progress is because they are the ones aware of what work they're doing. So if you apply the same context, if as a manager without a clue to what the work is, if I start putting teams together and say, thou shall work like this together. So if let's say I have 50 people and I put them into teams of 10 and I pick the team for them, it's a management responsibility to pick the teams. Then what happens is I have no context to what is required inside the teams to do the work. And therefore, if the teams fail, they are going to blame the management for putting together teams the way it has been put together. Whereas if I have teams, if I have 50 people and I tell them, you guys decide how you're going to break yourself into teams in the appropriate way to do the work that you're doing, then the responsibility is on the team to structure themselves in a way so that they can succeed with the work of how these 5 teams are going to work together in order to collaborate and produce the results that they have to produce. So that really goes down to the responsibility, whose it is. And it is not a lack of management control, because eventually the management still sets the overall direction. And the management is going to continue to validate whether the direction is on track. That is why sprint reviews exist. That is why we are always having these checks and balances. Should we continue the work? Can we ship the work to our customers? And what do our customers saying? Is there a feedback loop? What are the outcomes and what are the impact? Can we have customer metrics which tell us whether they are happy? Then we have customer metrics that tell us whether they are having the necessary impact that the customers are demanding from us. So there's always these checks and balances. And therefore, it is not really a loss of control. So that's the big shift with Scrum and large-scale Scrum and agile techniques. When you're using any agile method, whether it be Scrum or Kanban, or if you're using lean startup or any of the techniques which help you work in an agile way, then there is a necessity transfer of power and decision making to the teams in order to enable them to do the work. And that's what self-organization is about. So essentially, Scrum recommends at least self-managed teams. And it used to be called self-organized up to the 2017 Scrum Guide. They've actually downgraded that word to self-management. But then again, we wanted to look at the context to discuss and understand these terms. And that's what we have been doing right now. So it will grow into self-management. You might start with self-organizations. You might start with self-organization, but over a period of time, if the teams are going to grow into multiple teams that are going to work off the same backlog, then it organically grows into self-organization as well, because that would set them up to succeed and integrate as multiple teams and work together if they design it themselves.
So am I understanding the difference from self-organizing organization to self-management is on your kind of matrix here, going from self-managing to self-designing? Or it sounds like it might be the reverse.
Self-organization is actually self-designing, organizing ourselves. So design is organize. So that's
okay. So they've lowered kind of the level. So from self-designing down to self-managing.
That is correct.
Okay.
Guide us by the change in terminology. They have kind of lowered. I think probably my feeling is that self-organization was a hard sell in organizations anyway. Mm-hmm. And Scrum was not really practiced like that. Though I can tell you, over my last 10 years, I've helped spawn up several teams which are still self-organized out of the gate.
Mhm.
Because when I work with managers, I generally ask them, what do you want? Do you want the teams to succeed, or do you want to give them answers and blame you for the failure? And most managers would say, I want my teams to succeed. And so I would normally recommend that they allow the team to self-form and
Mhm.
help them do it rather than the other way around. Because if then the manager picks the team and says, you get together, and if they fail, they will come back and say, you put us together and therefore we failed. We didn't figure it out ourselves. So therefore, yes, you're right. The Scrum Guide has downgraded from self-organization to self-management. Though when we help form multiple Scrum teams, we still look at self-designed teams and self-organized teams out of the gate, in spite of what the Scrum team says for one team Scrum. Because the Scrum team's focus is on a single team. But what works at a single team level not necessarily works at a multi-team level. And that's the problem. So at a multi-team level, you still want to, how do you get a multitude of people? When you have 50 people, how do you get them to collaborate in a way that you don't create barriers to their work? Is that you need to transfer the ownership to them so that they figure out an answer to it. Then there's a better chance of success. And that's really why you need self-organization in the teams. And you're not really letting go of control, because you still have the boundary control of setting the overall direction. And you also have control through the heuristics of checking back. You're always checking in. It's not free lunch, or it's not a free ride. So you're always checking whether the work is progressing well and whether they're shipping out to the market to get validation. So it's always a system of checks and balances.
Right now,
So
I
yes.
could see where on an individual team versus multiple teams, or a matrix kind of organization, where it would almost be a hybrid of that, where up to a certain point, on a project, hey, these are the 10 people that are working on this, as the Scrum Master or project, or however you want to call the lead, figure out who you want, how you want to divide the task, but this is what you need to deliver, and when. But at a higher level, where there'd be more outside kind of a directive, I guess, for lack of probably the right word.
No, I'll give you a simple example how self-organization works. I had several Scrum teams where there are people problems. People have left the teams. Somebody quits and leaves the team. Now the team is already a cohesive unit and it's delivering, right? Then what happens is some resource manager would say, hey, XYZ is available. I'm going to put him on the team. And I have teams who have rejected those people. Sometimes the person who's coming in does not have the necessary skill set. So because one of the fundamentals in Scrum is that the whole collective team collectively should have all the skills required to do the work or acquire them. If you're not able to do that, you can't do the work. So if you throw a random person onto the team and they allocate it to the team becomes imbalanced. So I've had teams which have totally rejected people who are joining the teams because they did not have the necessary skill set, nor did they have a necessary pathway to acquire the skill set which was deficient. So it has happened at a one team level. So that is what you want in design. Rather, a better way for a manager to engage with the team is that, say, 2 people have left your team. What kind of skill sets or what kind of people do you need to complete your team would be a conversation the manager can have with the team. Then the team is involved in acquiring the right person for the job, and they're better set for success, even at a single team level. So
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. Yep.
Yeah, it all goes down to how we treat our people, right? On one side, we say we want more productivity from our teams. We want more engagement. We want teams to have more ownership. But if we can't just ask for ownership without giving them decision-making power.
But I think you run into a problem sometimes when you have a team that isn't that stable, where you're bringing in consultants and you have a budget based on what product you're delivering. If you're talking about a stable team of employees, it's one thing. But if you're bringing in people for specific product features, they may have a different skill set. You may need a different skill set too. When you get to multi-team, a lot of times you've got a new application, but you've also got older things that you have to interface with. So you need a combination of skills. Not everybody's going to be interchangeable.
Yeah, you're totally right. And you bring out a very important point, right? But that is a double-edged sword too. So if I bring a consultant in with a specific skill set, I cannot guarantee that the consultant will have full-time role. And this has happened in innumerable cases with consultants on my teams, which I helped coach. So we had some ERP specialists on our teams when I was working at Micron, and they said, I have only 25% work, and they just sit there in the corner. And we used to tell them, you are getting paid for it. So is there any way you can assist the team with any work? Because you are paying 100% of your time, but you're only doing 25% of the work because that's the work that's demand. So can you help in any way? So our learning from that is when subsequently we bought some consultants to do some Java work in an insurance engagement that I was, transformation that I was in Canada, which I was involved with. We made sure that we told the consultants that the consultants can pitch in and are expected to do learning and any kind of work because they are paid for the time. So we put in the clause. So we had better engagement from the consultants because of that. If they had the work that within the boundary of their knowledge and skills, they would do that. But if they didn't, then they would pitch in and do any work was there, including learning on the job. I would rather have them learn something and do some contribution than sit in the corner. So this is a double-edged sword. So there's no one single answer. It's only in context of the actual situation. But generally in Scrum, one of the primary approaches in Scrum, if you look at it, is there are no roles on the team. So if we go back to slide 1, okay, this slide, then there are no roles on the team. The teams are cross-functional. The members have necessary skills to create value. They are self-managing. They internally decide who does what, when, and how. So the moment we start picking skills and fostering specific skills on the team and breaking that rule of here's a skill and you stick to a skill, then Scrum will fall apart. It is just then become project management using iterations and increments, and that would not be Scrum. You are not going to get the best performance from a team where there's some degree of control over what skills a person would use, because the idea is to utilize the person to any capacity to do the work. So what happens if a particular type of work is not there in a sprint? I'm a product owner and I want something built, but I do not want a particular skill set. As a product owner, I'm not buying a skill set, I'm buying results. So therefore, I would rather have people who will pitch in and do some work than no work at all in a given context. So that will be my alternate argument, Sheila, to the scenario that you talked about.
But the argument is really with whoever's responsible for the budget. And a lot of times it might be the PMO, it might be the finance department, it might be procurement. In different organizations, it's in different places. But a lot of times you have to justify bringing in those additional resources for a specific purpose. You have to tie that budget to something. And you can't always bring in whoever you want and count on keeping them long term. Now, granted, you want to try to say something like, and other duties as assigned, which I always hate when it's in anything I have to sign up for. But that's the only way you can guarantee that you can, have someone who will pitch in. And the other thing is, a lot of times you need enough different skill sets that no one person can have them. And you really do have to have people matrixed. Maybe if you've got a team of multiple teams that are working together, maybe you have them matrixed to one team 20%, another team 30% in their specialty, because all the teams need a partial resource.
Well, that would all be project management. That wouldn't be Scrum. So the construct in Scrum is not to do that. We are learning not to do the behaviors that we were doing before. That is why Scrum calls out that whatever is done is product management and not project management. a series of projects do not make a product. Though a lot of organizations do it in a suboptimal way, and they continue to use Scrum as a project management tool. Scrum is not a project management tool. Though I would strongly argue that whatever Scrum in these organizations will be far from effective. It will be very ineffective Scrum, which does not utilize the engaged humans to do high quality of work. As long as you're doing resource management on the team, you are going to get similar results to what you do with project management. You wouldn't get anything more than that out of Scrum. And might as well, there wouldn't be any difference whether you do waterfall or Scrum. You could do waterfall and achieve the same results.
I disagree with that as well. But what you're talking about is, from whatever I've ever seen, sounds more like theoretical than practical in terms of the way corporations work.
Is it? And I've worked with over 150 Scrum teams, which I helped spin up in the last 10 years. And none of this I'm talking about is theoretical at all. So it might be the practices in your organization which are still hugely PMO centric. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's about what are you optimizing for? If you're optimizing for extremely engaged individuals and teams who can contribute the very best as a team, then the answers are not in what you described. And whatever you described as practices in Scrum are the ones that we are trying to change with Scrum. So I could clearly see that there is an approach that is actually not helping implement Scrum in a way that bring out the benefits that Scrum is supposed to bring to the teams. So though context matters, I'm not saying context does not matter, it does. But when I work in organizations, the first thing is that we try to do is break the management barriers of how the team can be given the necessary power and decision making that they deserve, that allows them to do the best work that they can do. And if you do not do that, and if you continue project management and resource management practices on Scrum teams, your ability to get the kind of performance from the team is highly negated. And if you are interested in having a one-on-one with me, you can book time and we can talk through your specific case and understand, and I can guide you to where the deficiencies are, because eventually it all comes down to what you define these terms to be. What is agile? What does it mean? What is Scrum? What does it mean? In Einstein's term, if you do the same thing and expect different results, that's a definition of insanity. So you have to have fundamental rethink of the way of work in enabling humans is what is Scrum and Agile is all about. Though a lot of organizations get away with very minimal change, but they also get very minimal results out of it, because then if the goal is competing against organizations like Amazon today or Facebook or Twitter or Google, and when they are going to disrupt your industry, be ready to compete against them. If that is the goal, then whatever you pointed out as answers as hybrid situations where you're managing people is not potentially going to help you meet those goals. And if those are your goals, then your answers are not in the way you approach them. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's you get the results of whatever you put into it. And if you're looking at the highest performance teams, you might need to push beyond what you're doing today. That might not be enough.
What you're talking about seems to be the situation where you're talking specifically about the development team being empowered, but not necessarily producing the product that the organization needs in order to remain profitable, because they may get enamored of bells and whistles.
No, I think that's a mistake too. Product backlog management is about the whole product for the whole organization. So I have product owners, I can point you to case studies large-scale Scrum is being practiced in BMW to build the new self-driving car that they're building. We have 1,000 people. We have 1,000 people working there in a single large-scale Scrum group where they build, in every 2 weeks, they build a new version of the hardware and software to put the car out on the test track. And there is no project management office. There is no resource management. These teams, about 60 or 70 teams that are working together, they will cohesively build software every 2 weeks using common practices and direct collaboration with each other. So that's what I made a comment earlier, that a series of projects do not make a product. Product management is taking the highest value and creating something in the shortest possible time that can be shipped. So Scrum or large-scale Scrum or large-scale agile methods, whatever might be, a combination of Scrum, Kanban, or Lean Startup, all thrive on building something that can be shipped very quickly and validated in the market, or validated by fully functioning products. In this case, the BMW car is one of them. So that's how you take a product to market. So to do that, project management is generally based on long cycle practices. You spend a year or more planning what happens in the next year, which is an illusion anyway. You cannot predict what happens in the next year today. And then you allocate people for all of what is being done next year today. And then you try to make sure that the plan is executed exactly as the illusionary plan was put together 2 years back. Now, that is not product management. You cannot build customer-centric products using project management. You have to inspect and adapt. And everything changes every 2 weeks. That's how product management works. And product management is purely based on market feedback. So you ship something, market tells you, this is not what I want something else. Then I inspect and adapt, and I completely change my backlog and features in order to please and satisfy the customer in the next release, or as quickly as I can if it cannot be done in the next 2 weeks. So we're talking about two different things totally. So what I perceive, Sheila, is that you are in a command and control organization which believes that they are putting Scrum to use. And I would challenge you that it's far away from the truth. There are thousands of case studies that I can point to and videos that we do. And my own work with teams, I've been working for the last 15 years as an agile coach. And over that period of time, I worked with hundreds of teams, and many of them are self-organized out of the gate. And they determine a lot of work themselves. And that's truly feasible if you set them up for success.
Since anything I say, you're just going to tell me I'm wrong, even though my background is more in product management, I don't think there's any point in me commenting further.
No, I'm not telling you that you're wrong. I'm just suggesting.
You said those words a few times now.
Well, essentially, I'm saying this is a paradigm shift. Agile and Scrum is a paradigm shift. Whatever you described is not the paradigm shift. All I'm pointing out is
what you're describing, where the development team is driving the process, which is what you're really describing, although you don't seem to feel that way.
Well, what part of the process is the development team driving here? I do not understand that. Where does the backlog come from? The backlog comes from stakeholders. The backlog comes from strategy sessions from senior management. The backlog comes from customer needs, the customer feedback, and what you get from the market. The backlog comes from what your market and the competitors are doing. So how is the development team doing what they want? And the backlog comes from validation by shipping products as quickly as possible to get market feedback on whether you shipped made sense at all. And that feedback goes back into the product backlog. So I'm missing the point. How is the development team determining their own work? That's the question that I'm asking. So nothing that I indicated here is the development team indicating their own work. Not at all, far from it. So Scrum and Agility, I explained like this. We might like it or not. This is moving from a parent-child relationship. As parents, we always want to tell our children what to do. We want to have the best for them. We want to establish the behaviors that we have built in ourselves. But Agility and Scrum and Agile methods are about adult-adult relationships. It's treating people as adults and getting out of the way. That's the primary construct that we talked about. Scrum is getting out of the way so that the people who design and develop the work, the creators of the work, the artists who do the work, are allowed to do their best work that they can validate in the market. So that's the crux of Scrum and Agile methods really, is getting out of the way. As long as we are spoon feeding answers to the team and saying, here is a feature, build it exactly as I decided 8 months ago. This was funded with a business case which we wrote last year, and please design it exactly as prescribed in the requirements document and ship it. That is far from the Agile methods that we're talking about. So I'm not trying to demean your work. I have no clue to where you are, which company you work for, and the context of the work that you do.
You made a bunch of assumptions about what it means when I say that the product, what the product manager does or the product owner does that are not necessarily valid, because you're automatically assuming that means based on a couple of things that everything else is following waterfall, which isn't necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to belabor it because you have other points you want to cover.
Yes, certainly, no problem. And I would be glad to spend some time with you to understand your context before I can guide you to what potentially your options might be, because I'm blind to your context. But irrespective of context, this is the Scrum and Agile I teach, I work with, and I've done years of work on that. And that's the world that we are taking our people to, is an adult-adult relationship where we treat people as adults. It's as simple as that. There's nothing more than that. It's a question of trust and providing them a safe space to work, and that would lead to enormous results and engaged people. That's the crux of it. It's not about the nitty-gritty of Scrum at all or a backlog. They are organically come from the fact that you treat adults as adults. Okay, moving on then. Thank you. So there are two other topics that are left. One is accountability and responsibility. Accountability and responsibility, I'll cover it right here on the slide, is we looked at the responsibility of the team. The only thing that the Scrum Guide does, it used to be called responsibility. They've changed to the word accountability now. Now, in my personal opinion, that's a poor choice of word in the English language. In fact, English is one of the few languages where there are two words, accountability and responsibility. If you speak other languages, especially the European languages, if German or French or Dutch, there is no other word for responsibility. There's no equivalent to the word accountability. So accountability and responsibility, what does it mean, right? Accountability and responsibilities. Responsibility in the English term is that I take responsibility by signing on to it. It's a volunteering step. I take ownership for a problem by putting up my hand and saying, hey, I want to take responsibility. So it is a volunteering effect. Accountability is being forced from a system to take whether you like it or not. So that is the difference. The Scrum Guide again has made a backward step there in using accountability of the word. I still don't understand. I don't have sufficient information to why this word change was made, but I just wanted to point out that the word has been changed to accountability now. Probably because of the organizations and the way they do them. But again, I see the European context. I work with hundreds of coaches in Europe as part of the large-scale Scrum group. And we see that in Europe, we don't teach it this way because there is no other word for accountability accountability and responsibility both translate to responsibility in a European context. And I don't know how it is in Asian languages, but something that I wanted to point out.
Well, if you're talking about responsibility versus accountability, I think it goes back to the RACI. Are you familiar with that?
Again, the RACI is not a construct that we use for Scrum. Again, these are past constructs that we are talking, constructs that we move away from. Again, accountability and responsibility. Let's unpack these two words. Responsibility for me is volunteering based. I put up my hand and I sign up for it. Accountability is something that somebody forces on you by saying that you are accountable for this work. That's the only distinction between those two terms. And we are not definitely looking at it from a RACI construct. For us, the Scrum team is always accountable and responsible either way. Now, if you look at the word here, in this chart, it's always about responsibility. We have management responsibility and team's own responsibility. But in self-managing and self-designing teams, you can't force responsibility on the other player. So you can't force accountability. So responsibility is always through volunteering. People do their best when they say, I sign up to do things. So for example, I would say you are at the beginning of the year and you say, I want to lose weight and I want to go to the gym. So I take responsibility to go to the gym. I can't go and tell somebody you should be accountable to go to the gym next year and lose some weight. And that's not a good plan that I can force on somebody else, just as an example. So all I wanted to do is point out is that does the terminology change? A lot of coaches and top practitioners who have been practicing Scrum for 15, 20 years or more feel it's a retrograde step, and we will possibly continue to teach it as a responsibility. And even in the language context, there's a lot of confusion around why the term was introduced, and definitely not from a RACI perspective though. And the last thing that we are going to talk about is we'll spend some time on planning. I think we are a little behind time. It's 8 o'clock. I think we'll wrap up with the last one, which is about planning. Earlier in Scrum, planning had part 1 and part 2. There were 2 parts to planning. Earlier, there were only 2 parts to planning. Planning part 1. Part 1 was you picked you looked at the PBI and you picked the SBI items for that sprint. And then in part 2, you looked at the SBIs and then you looked at what does it take to do the work. So if you want to do task breakdown or break down the work, you could do the part work. Now there's an additional part added to it, which is clearly trying to say, what is in the context of the product goal, why are we doing this PBIs this time, this work in the context of the big goal for the product? Why are we doing that? So Scrum has introduced a third segment, actually the first one. So the product owner starts with what is our big goal for the product? This is the big goal. And how does our sprint goal here tie into the big goal, and which ties into the daily goal and I doing the daily work? So that has been added as an extra step in planning. Again, you could do product goal in 5 minutes. You could spend half an hour, 1 hour, it doesn't matter. In fact, I would be surprised if many of our teams, we were already doing it. When we went into a sprint planning session, we already had a vision for the product. And from the vision, we derived in the context of the vision, why are we doing the work that we're doing for the product? So, but Scrum is just formalizing that in terms of a product goal conversation to bring transparency around the fact that it is important to do the work that aligns to the product goal to bring the transparency to that conversation. So that's something that has been added in the Scrum Guide as well. Though again, now it's a 3-part structure, many of my advanced Scrum teams have done all of this in as low as 10 minutes and got on with a 2-week sprint. So if you're well prepared, if you do sufficient refinement in your previous sprints for the work that comes down the pipe, if you've been doing a pre-work and breaking work down, you're spending enough time on refinement in your previous sprints, then there should be no surprise when you go into a sprint planning. You can easily pick and say, these are the 4 items that we are trying to do, supporting the same product goals. Nothing has changed with the product goals. And let's jump in and start doing it. And there are many of my teams who do not even do task breakdown. They know that these are abstract sizes to do this work. This item is about 3 days, this is about 4 days, this is about 6 days, this is like a large, that's like a medium, and these are the 4 things that we are going to do. And they start jumping and start doing the work. In as low as 10 minutes, we have done all 3 steps of a product planning and then proceeded to do the work. Again, context matters, and the way the practices that the team practice matters. So again, this is something that I want to point out as a big change in the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide calls out, perhaps they wanted to point out that you want to take some time and think of the big goal before you jump in and start doing the work. You don't want to do mindless work in the sprint without looking at the big picture or tying it to the big picture. So they are now started calling it out in the Scrum Guide as a specific step in planning, which substantiates what used to be there before, which we used to call planning part 1 and part 2. Now planning has become a 3-part event. But again, like I said, it doesn't need to be parts, it doesn't need to be phases. Planning as an event can be very small and nimble. And if you are really truly agile, you'll figure out a way how to plan the least amount of time and then spend the most amount of time doing the work. And there are different pathways to get there. So I'm going to wrap it up with this. So are there any last minute questions? I can stay on for another 5-10 minutes if there's anything specific that you are looking answers to. I'm just going to switch to the Q&A slide. And if there are any questions. So here's one question, which is that participants of a Scrum team have different levels of Scrum maturity. What are some of the strategy to make some mixed teams effective? Now, there are hundreds of strategies for that. Again, I have no context. It depends on who put this question there. Would you be able to give some context to it? I don't know whether the person is still there. So it looks like the person who put the question is not there, but I can give a broad level answer to that. It's good to actually have different levels of Scrum maturity, because as long as you have some practitioners who have been practicing for a longer time, there's a rub-off effect for the team members who are newer, because they just learn from them. They just the standard practices that the practitioners have been doing for a long time, they learn them first. Sorry, I apologize. So I'll start writing some of the answers there. So the first step would be actually to have the senior members coach the junior members. So there we go. Team coaching each other. The second thing would be, if they are junior members, start with teaching, send them to classes. Now there's a big difference in how I teach Scrum and when I coach, and a lot of other people do. We spend a lot of investment of time on teaching. I typically, when I spin up a team or even part of a team which is new to Scrum, we go back to the classroom, spend a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, learning the construct. So we spend time learning it, then you're much faster. So you don't want to jump in and do the work. So you want to pause and learn and then do the work. And then, of course, substantiated by coaching. So coaching would be, if you have experienced Scrum Masters, they would be the coaches for the new members. They will coach the teams, or additional coaching from outside, depending on if the Scrum Masters are not senior enough, additional coaching from outside, from agile coaches who can work with the teams to provide the necessary coaching. And then on top of it, all the standard interaction techniques, including pair programming, pair programming, and learning Scrum by pairing people of different experiences together. Mob programming, again, by working on full features end-to-end by mobbing, where all the team members participate by rotation. Pair programming, typically 12-minute pairs, is pair switch work. Mob programming, typically 25 minutes, one person doing the work and switching. A whole group or part of the Scrum team participates in the mobbing. Then other things like multi-team events, multi-team training events like community of practices is a big one. You do community of practices, brown bag lunches, things like that, where people talk about success stories during, we have brown bag lunch session, articulating the work done and how the way of work is done, watching YouTube videos of how other teams do the work, case studies, reading case studies of large organizations. There are lots of books. There are books on Google, there are books on Facebook, how they do the work. There are books on Microsoft and their implementation of Scrum, how Microsoft became one of the top agile organizations. They completely flipped their organization from the Steve Ballmer days to Satya Nadella now running the organization has flipped in the last 10 years from being a very nimble organization and moved to the cloud is a case study. There are lots of books and material around that. So there are lots of ways to make this effective. And I'm just calling out just a few of them. And when we actually coach, there are various other tools and techniques beyond that. Any questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, I think I've had a great time with you guys. Sorry, it went about half an hour overboard than the planned end at 7:45. So thank you for being here, and thanks for all the questions. And for those who have made it to the very end, I appreciate being here and the support. And you can reach out to me. Any further questions that you have. We have the active meetup group. We also have a LinkedIn group, and we'll send you the details for participating in that. We also plan to start a Slack channel so we can bring these conversations and interactions between each of you, so I can facilitate a platform that will allow you to get together. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.